Okay, good morning everybody. I should get started. Good morning, my name is Karsten Friis. I work here at NUPI. I will be a moderator today. Today's morning breakfast seminar, we will talk about American policy under President Trump. I think it's 104th day today, if I counted correctly. So it's time to take stock of what has happened so far. And of course, as you all know, we were all rather concerned about what President Trump would represent when it comes to foreign policy and security policy. America first was the slogan. NATO, question marks around NATO, and of course trade deals and free trade and lots of questions about radical change or indications of radical change in foreign policy. Now, so far, I guess it's been more not so radical, but still many surprises. The UN ambassador showing pictures of small dead children after the Syrian gas attack doesn't, in the EU Security Council, doesn't represent a big change as a liberal world order, so to speak, still present in the US foreign policy, at least on the surface. Well, how to assess this? We have an excellent panel today. Our colleagues and partners from the Center for New American Security are visiting us, and it's a very high-level panel we got today for you. So this is going to be exciting. So let me introduce the panel. They will speak a certain amount of time each, then we'll open for Q&A. Simple as that. And this event is streamed live, so if you miss some good points, you can always go back to YouTube and find it again. Now, let me introduce the panel. First, Michèle Flournoy. She's the co-founder of the CNAS, Center for New American Security, and the CEO today of that organization. But you have served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the previous administration. So strategic guidance, strategic thinking, and defense matters has been your portfolio for a long time. But you have also more academic background than before being in the government for CSIS and also National Defense University. You also, in the 90s, served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. So you've been in the government before, in the 90s. And then there's a whole long list of other things. I recommend you go into the website and see it. I can't read it all, but it's a very impressive CV. And then Julianne Smith, Senior Fellow and Director of Strategy and Statecraft Program at CNAS, if you got it right. You served as Senior Vice President. You are Senior Vice President also at the same time, right, at the Beacon Global Strategies. And you were Deputy National Security Advisor for Joe Biden from 2012 to 2013. You also served as a Principal Director for European and NATO Policy in the Office of Secretary of Defense in Pentagon. And of course, you also have CSIS background. We worked a lot on transatlantic questions, and you still do that today. And last but not least, Jerry Hendrix, Senior Fellow, Director of Defense Strategy and Forces Program at CNAS. You are a Navy captain, retired. So you have worked as Chief of Naval Operations Executive Panel, among other things. You worked Homeland Defense questions, Naval Aviation, Navy Missile Defense, Office of Undersecretary of the State. And you also worked with Andrew Marshall, I think, in the famous Office of Net Assessment. That's a bit nerdish for military people, but if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. Now, three very good, excellent experts who are going to give us their assessment of the situation 104 days in. So with no further ado, I will pass the floor to Michèle, you first, and then you move on. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much to NUPI for hosting us. It's a pleasure to be back in Oslo and to bring the spring along with us. So, this administration, I think, inherits a very dynamic and complex security environment. It's a very challenging time. I mean, you look across the regions of the world, and we see multiple crises, multiple threats, and challenges. And I won't illuminate them or list them here for you, for this audience, but I think the most important thing is that the basic rules-based order that has provided for a degree of stability and economic growth and prosperity since the end of World War II is really under siege from several quarters. A rising China that seeks to change some of the rules of the road, a resurgent Russia who is clearly not abiding by many of those rules of the road, and non-state actors like violent extremist groups, terrorist groups, who completely ignore the existence of the rules. So for any administration, this would be an incredibly challenging time in foreign policy. I think because this administration has come in sort of questioning some of the fundamentals of what I would call the U.S. bipartisan foreign policy consensus, there's now an additional factor in the mix, which is fundamental uncertainty about the role that the U.S. will choose to play in the world and in addressing these challenges. The latest, parlor game or obsession in Washington, D.C. is sort of reading the tea leaves of, the president's tweets or the statements of individual officials, whether it's the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, or the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, the appointment of personnel, trying to read between the lines of these individual discrete actions to try to discern what is U.S. foreign policy in a Trump administration going to be. So in answer to the fundamental question of this panel about a Trump doctrine, I don't think there is one yet. It's not discernible. But I think we can go through what we've seen in the first 100 or 104 days and find some good news and some not so good news. So on the good news side, I think that the president has appointed an increasingly strong national security team. When you have someone like Jim Mattis bringing tremendous experience, I think the departure of General Flynn and the arrival of H.R. McMaster has brought renewed discipline and focus and seriousness to the National Security Council process. And so that's a source of good news. And I think as the administration's been challenged to deal with individual meetings or events, the meeting with President Xi, the meeting with the NATO Secretary General, and so forth, the statements coming out of those meetings have actually been quite reassuring, kind of sounding more like the traditional bipartisan policy consensus than maybe some of the campaign rhetoric that we heard earlier on. And so that has, there have been several columnists in Washington who've sort of collectively sighed with relief that, okay, maybe the administration's going to actually be somewhere in the traditional bipartisan consensus. But I think it's too early to come to that conclusion, personally. I think it remains to be seen. The bad news is that the administration is way behind by any objective measure in appointing people to the national security team. So a lot of the cabinet level officials are virtually home alone. They obviously have the civil service and the foreign service, but in terms of their political appointed team, it's been very slow, and that constrains the abilities of the department and the interagency process. I think when we've seen actions taken, whether, perhaps, for example, the strike against Syria, while some may have supported the individual action, it still begs the question of what's the larger U.S. strategy in Syria at this point. So we're still looking for, and same with North Korea, a lot of statements on North Korea, not yet clear what the strategy is. Now, again, to be fair, I think a lot of administrations take some time to come to broader strategy decisions, but there's a real sense of urgency to get to those sooner rather than later. Another piece of bad news, I believe, is the early view of the budget. The budget proposal is to substantially increase defense spending, which some of us may support, but to do so by dramatically cutting non-defense spending, particularly the State Department and USAID. And as someone who spent hours in the Situation Room trying to work the integration of how we use all of the elements of our power and make sure that our diplomacy and our defense and our development work is actually being used together to get to a common objective, whether it's preventing a crisis from becoming a conflict or helping to create stability after a war has occurred. You have to have a healthy balance in those instruments, and I fear that we're on the road to creating even deeper imbalance. That would be very harmful to our ability to the administration to actually implement its priorities. I think it's also still at this point unclear whether what the oversight role of the National Security Council is going to be, when it comes to things like the delegation of authority. You know, every president comes in trying to correct the mistakes of his predecessor or the perceived mistakes of his predecessor. You know, I think Trump came in believing that Obama had micromanaged the departments too much, particularly military operations. And so they've taken some steps to delegate authorities down. And that may make sense in some, you know, in the context of a campaign with clear objectives and so forth. But you want to have oversight to make sure that the military instrument remains used consistent with your broader policy objectives and constraints. But the bottom line thing that still keeps me awake at night is that because of the slow staffing, because of the lack of depth of experience around the table, because of the president's lack of experience in foreign policy, I do worry about the administration's ability to handle a major crisis. That, you know, and history tells us that every administration, American administration since FDR, has had a major foreign policy crisis in its first year. And the question is, what is it going to be, and how will it be handled? And will it, you know, and will there still be bandwidth and energy to maintain a proactive focus on strategy going forward? So let me conclude by saying, you know, even if the administration, you know, with the team coming in, manages to pull it together and handle each challenge that pops up reasonably well, which is a big if. But even if they do that, I think we will be on our back foot. We will be in a bad position if there isn't also a strategy for U.S. leadership, proactive leadership in certain areas. For example, in the wake of pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, how is the U.S. going to lead in Asia? How do we avoid a situation where a vacuum isn't created and China comes in and writes rules that are not in our interests or those of our partners? In the face of a resurgent Russia, the next 4 to 5 years of investment in deterrence and reassurance are absolutely critical to determine whether we're going to be successful. The U.S. can't just react in this situation, we have to lead. So will we be able to do that? Issues like climate, you know, will the U.S. sustain our commitments under the Paris Accords? And so let me stop there because I've gone on too long. But I think the real question is one of not only crisis management, but what will U.S. strategy be? What will our leadership posture be? Because the opportunities are there, and in my view, putting America first as a doctrine should necessitate U.S. leadership to actually shape the rules-based order and adapt it for the future.
Great. Well, thanks again to NUPI for hosting us this morning, and it's nice to see some old friends, folks that we've worked with along the way on our side of the Atlantic. I just wanted to say a few words on the transatlantic relationship more specifically and follow up to some of what Michèle said. She was talking about the fact that this is a very rich national security agenda that the administration is facing. And I think on the transatlantic front, it's a complex one as well. Europe obviously is facing an array of internal and external challenges that you all know very well, whether it's the migration crisis that has certainly been reduced in terms of the severity of the challenge, but the migration challenge remains a critical issue for Europe to grapple with right now. There are counterterrorism challenges, there's Brexit, there's Russian aggression, a couple of weak economies on the European continent, the rise of populist parties, the list goes on and on. We too, on our side of the Atlantic, have an array of challenges, and then collectively, obviously, broader questions about the future of the rules-based order. And so from a transatlantic perspective, there's plenty to sink our teeth into. And in terms of what we've seen from the administration so far, as Michèle laid out, I think there's some good news and bad news. Certainly for the NATO nerds in the audience, people that have the NATO gene like myself, I've been watching what the administration has been saying and doing on NATO, and I felt reassured in many ways. Obviously, Secretary Mattis is someone that's deeply familiar and committed to the NATO alliance. H.R. McMaster, I would put in that category as well. I think Tillerson has learned some lessons along the way. I think the reaction to his initial announcement that Tillerson would be skipping a NATO ministerial and then pivoting to say, no, I'll be there, we'll move the date so I can make it. I think there's been some important learning going on. I'm encouraged by the fact that the president will be attending the mini summit or the lunch that they've arranged on May 25th in Brussels. I think, for me, I had an open question about whether or not the president would even want to go to something like that. So the fact that that will be his first opportunity to sit down and meet with other heads of state on NATO issues is an important one and a decision that I certainly welcome. So, I think in terms of where we started during the campaign, where as a candidate, Trump on a number of occasions called the alliance obsolete, and now is saying actually it's not so obsolete, has been reassuring. On the other hand, the fact that he's saying, the money's pouring in and everything's changed, and I mentioned counterterrorism during the campaign, and now the alliance is focused on counterterrorism. Well, not a lot of truth in all of that, but if that gets him to believe that NATO's no longer obsolete, I'll take it. So on the NATO front, I think certainly we can find some points to appreciate. But on the European Union side, that's where I worry a little bit more. We've no doubt seen a situation where the president learns often through personal engagement with world leaders, and he's had some very constructive meetings with world leaders in recent months. I think the meeting he had with Chancellor Merkel was an important one, and there were a lot of little tidbits that leaked out of that engagement where she helped him appreciate the fact that no, in fact, the United States cannot negotiate a bilateral trade deal with Germany, that we would have to route it through Brussels, and he seemed to walk away with a better understanding of how trade is managed in Europe. But at the same time, we've seen several instances where his closest tutor on issues tied to the European Union is actually a guy by the name of Nigel Farage, who, as we all know, is very anti-EU in his views. And as a result, we've seen cases where not only the president himself, but his son is expressing support for Marine Le Pen and her very anti-EU, anti-immigrant platform, and that has me a little bit worried. I think we will not see a strong champion on his team advocate for strong EU-US ties. Certainly Mattis and McMaster, while they're supporters of the Transatlantic Relationship, I think won't want to waste too much capital on convincing him to support the European Union. And that, to be fair, it's not really in Mattis's mandate to make that case. So I wonder who would make that case, if anyone, in the Trump administration, to talk about the importance of the EU-US relationship, despite the fact that there's plenty of things we'd all like to change and things that aren't working well in that relationship. And it was no secret that Obama also had some real reservations about the utility of EU-US summits, and in fact skipped one in 2010, you may remember, and that caused a lot of ruffled feathers on the other side of the Atlantic. But in any case, I worry about a situation where Nigel Farage is increasingly whispering into his ear to instruct him on the EU and EU matters. And that has been also reflected in some personal engagements that Trump's team has had with EU ambassadors in town. A couple of them have been asked when they're leaving the European Union, and that frustrates them because it shows a lack of understanding about other European countries' views towards that institution. So going forward, I think that's one issue that worries the transatlantic community, certainly on our side of the Atlantic, and I've heard on your side as well. But the other thing that I would mention is Turkey. Turkey is obviously one of the toughest challenges that we face collectively, trying to navigate this very difficult, complex relationship with a country that, on a Monday is an incredibly important ally, and on a Tuesday really serves often to counter both European and American interests. And so Turkey was going to be a challenge for any president coming into the Oval Office. But I think many looked at the phone call, the congratulations after the referendum that Erdogan recently had, with some concern. And so again, there's an open-ended question there about where Trump wants to take the U.S.-Turkey relationship going forward. So broadly, I think, along with what Michèle said, we occasionally see signs of the administration trending to, again, the bipartisan consensus on U.S. foreign policy, but there are other cases where it seems very loose and without a rudder. And so I think the fact of the matter is, at day 104, we don't really know what the transatlantic policy of this administration will be going forward. But there are things that we should be looking for. As Michèle noted, the personnel appointments will matter, and we're starting to see some names float to the surface for those assistant secretary positions, the deputy assistant secretary positions, a NATO ambassador position. As those people start to fall into place, we may feel more reassured as we see some of the longstanding transatlantic hands settle into their seats and drive a kind of coherent policy going forward. The other clues we'll look for, obviously, what happens at the May 25th meeting. Will NATO be able to deliver some concrete ideas moving forward in the area of counterterrorism and burden sharing, the two topics of the May 25th NATO summit or non-summit? We'll have to watch that and see how Trump responds to it. And if he walks away with some positive tweets about the utility of the alliance and the importance of the transatlantic pillar, then we'll all, I think, feel somewhat more reassured. And then specifically trying to understand what the exact policies are going to be going forward. Will this administration want to keep forces in Europe? Will they want to enhance our deterrent posture towards Russia? What will be the overarching policy of this administration towards Russia? We've seen a little bit of everything. We've seen some softer approaches to Russia, particularly from Trump himself, very interested in collaborating and cooperating with the Russians, and yet also willing to push back on Russia, willing to take those strikes in Syria, knowing it would upset Putin. Tillerson and Mattis, of course, have said, they're going to hold Russia accountable. They want to keep the Minsk protocol in place in Ukraine. So on the Russia front, we're still waiting to understand what is U.S. policy towards Russia going forward. Tillerson's press conference with Lavrov a couple of weeks ago was tough. And I think he said many of the right things and was willing to talk about things like cyber. Didn't say as much about disinformation or their interference in our election. But still, I think many found that press conference reassuring. So we're just trying to determine whether or not that represents our policy going forward, or again, whether or not it was just a one-off and we'll see a shift again going forward. So to conclude, it's early days. And as Michèle noted, for any administration, it takes some time to get their sea legs and determine what the policy is going forward. In some cases, the administration will want to conduct reviews of our policy, particularly towards Russia going forward. And so we may have to wait a little bit longer to hear specifically what that policy is going to look like. So for me, I have, weeks where I see the semblance of a policy on the transatlantic front, and other days I really scratch my head and wonder, because there are moments where the administration contradicts itself on those transatlantic Russia issues. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague Jerry Hendrix, who will no doubt find a different take probably than what Michèle and I are putting forward here.
Good morning, and again, thank you for hosting us here today. It's great to come over and have this type of a conversation. I enjoy coming to work every day with my colleagues. I tend to be from the center right. I'm a self-described Eisenhower Republican by upbringing, coming out of the Midwestern area of the country, although Julie's from the Midwest as well. But I will say that Donald Trump represents a significant portion of the United States, and clearly, through his election. But if you look at the demographic spread on where his general support is, and there's a large question throughout the majority, or not a majority, but a large portion of the country as to the U.S. foreign policy going forward. And if there's one thing that's been to our advantage, because I'm a supporter of the alliance and the alliances that the United States has built up over the last 70 years, in the international rule set system that we've constructed. But to the degree that Donald Trump's election, the process, and then the first 104 days as we move forward, is the country has had a conversation about the nature of alliances and what their relative importance is and what a level of investment is significant and what type of conversation that we want to have with alliance partners to a degree that we haven't had in probably 25 years or so about the relative importance of these things. This ongoing conversation is going to continue to evolve, but we're at the beginning of it right now. And as we see the president come up with these questions and then go through the internal deliberations, we're also seeing the nation have those conversations as well going forward. So I think that that is a positive. To the degree that we had questions about the relative importance of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that was something that was concerning to me. As someone who was in the Navy for 26 years and exercised and operated with partner nations in 3 conflicts, Desert Storm and then in Yugoslavia, and then coming back to the Middle East again at the end of my career, I, of course, was very comfortable and confident in the alliance and the capabilities that it brought and the dependence that we had in a number of key areas upon the alliance. So there were just areas that the United States had not made investment that the alliance had, and so we were dependent on them, areas like minesweeping and so on, and we really did look to them to be there. And so we need to continue to have that conversation. Second, personnel is policy. And it's something that both Julie and Michelle have talked about. What we've seen, and it's kind of interesting because, first of all, I had not read a single book written by Donald Trump prior to the election. After the election, I went out and began to read them. And what has been interesting, and even to the degree that it's frustrating, is the deliberative process that we've seen on selecting and appointing senior personnel is reflected in a lot of his previous work in real estate. So if he took an area of project development that he had no experience, he generally took a long time finding the right team. But then when he found the team, hired the team, he brought his projects in under budget and ahead of schedule. So, the Woolman ice skating rink in Central Park, some area that he'd never had any experience, but he found the best team that he could. And as we see the development, I think General Mattis, for those of us who have served with General Mattis, the warrior monk, for a vast majority of my career, Mattis is superb. And for that matter, H.R. McMaster is a godlike figure in the Army, an intellectual giant and a certified warrior. And so we're all pleased to see that type of team come together. Secretary Tillerson is someone that I had no exposure, but the more that I've seen him wrestle with the issues that confront him, you can see the star power that the man has. There's clearly gravitas there, so I expect to see the team mature. But as we fill the tree going downward, I expect to see senior level talent come in there, and hopefully at the appropriate level. I would like to see him sooner rather than later, but it will come, and I think we'll have a strong, solid team. As far as Trump doctrine goes, I think there actually is a discernible doctrine that's beginning to emerge. I would term it as strategic ambiguity. The idea of introducing uncertainty into the process so that the United States is no longer considered to be predictable. Now, some might see that to be disadvantageous because they like when you have a large superpower to actually figure out what it's going to do next. But the fact of the matter is by introducing uncertainty into the equation, it forces others to think about their next action prior to taking, because they have to then try to predict the unpredictable. We've seen some indications of this. Certainly the 59 missiles into Syria over chocolate cake was something that destabilized the situation, and I'm sure that President Xi Jinping did not appreciate that, or his team, but at the same time that sent a clear signal. It sent it not only to President Xi, but also to Vladimir Putin. I think the decision to delegate the authority to drop the Moab in Afghanistan also sent a key indicator. The idea that we would delegate authority on weapon selection or weaponeering of that level down to the regional combatant commander or lower is a change. And we actually saw those two decisions have an implication recently when we had the kerfluffle around the movement of the Carl Vinson Strike Group in the Western Pacific, where at first it was announced that it was heading to North Korea, and then it was revealed that it's actually participating in an exercise, and then it's moved back. And what we found out about that was that the movement of aircraft carriers in a Trump administration takes on a slightly higher significance and magnitude so far as indication and intent than what it has in previous administrations because of the uncertainty, because of the delegation of authority. There was an assumption made that the regional combatant commander, Admiral Harry Harris, had decided to move the carrier, and that he was doing so, perhaps absent, direct order from the president. And so that changes the equation, introduces that uncertainty. By the way, that's not the first time in U.S. history that uncertainty has been a major portion of foreign policy. Previous presidents that have pursued that include Ronald Reagan. They pursued Dwight Eisenhower, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Theodore Roosevelt. All had foreign policies that had a huge focus on uncertainty, being unpredictable. And that's a pretty good crowd. And by the way, the two Roosevelts are New Yorkers, and I'm not sure that has something to do, there may be something in the water in that state, but every time that we've had a president from New York, things tend to get a little bit unstable. So that being said, what we do see in clear, hard numbers, though, is President Trump is committed to increasing the size of the military. The 350-ship Navy was a major campaign issue for him, and that although we have not seen that reflected in the budget, he is still verbally committed that he wants to increase the size of the Navy, increase the size of the Air Force, increase the size of the Army and the Marine Corps. That will not come with little expense. There's going to be a lot of money that comes behind that. We're still waiting to see how that settles out in the budget, but it has clear implications not only for us at home in our domestic economy, but it also has implications for our allies and partners as we look at where those platforms will go. What we do know now from a naval standpoint, again, my area of interest, is that we do not have a Navy of sufficient size to meet all of our overseas commitments. 275 ships is simply not enough to be able to properly service the 18 maritime regions of the world where the United States has demonstrated national interest. And as we have vacated those or gapped those vital areas, what we have seen is regional powers have risen up to challenge us. And so, for instance, because we're no longer in the Black Sea on a persistent basis, that there was some challenges there. The Baltic has become a challenging area. The Arctic will be a challenging area, and quite frankly, the U.S. Navy isn't actually properly configured to operate in the Arctic. South China Sea had significant periods of gapped coverage, and so we saw the creation of these artificial islands. So these types of things are things that happen when your fleet gets too small to be there on a consistent basis. And what I would say is the U.S. Navy at 350, that is the minimum number of ships required to be able to meet these basic servicing capabilities around the planet. We would actually need a fleet higher than that in order to be perhaps more robust. But what we would hope to see is a greater partnership with our allies and partners as we move into these areas, and maybe even consideration of some of the building, the ships that are being constructed by our allies and partners, some of those design plans for possible building in the United States. So with that, that's sort of the top level down to the lower level, we can open up.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you. Let me start, because I see a little disagreement here, so let's try to call it that. Strategic ambiguity, deliberate, unpredictable. I guess, Michèle, you would consider it, maybe you would see it as more like trying and failing. It's not deliberate, but it's trial and error. What's your comment?
I mean, unpredictability that results from lack of strategy or coherence is one thing. Unpredictability that's by design for a targeted purpose is something else. And while I recognize that there are certain cases in which unpredictability can put your challenger, your competitor, your adversary kind of on their back foot, make them, pause, hesitate, rethink. General unpredictability has tremendous costs as well in terms of our allies and partners, because our allies and partners need to know that they can count on the United States to have their backs. They need to know what they can expect of the United States, because when they don't, they will likely start to hedge. And for the classic case of this has been periods, I think we could be entering a period where, absent very clear statements and actions of resolve on the part of the United States, you could have some of our allies in Asia rethinking their nuclear posture, for example. Can we count on extended deterrence from the United States in the face of China and North Korea, or can we not? And if we're not sure, because the U.S. is too unpredictable, we may have to take certain matters into our own hands, and that would not be in U.S. interest. So I think unpredictability by design to throw off an adversary or try to deter that adversary is one thing. General unpredictability can have some real costs and risks associated with it.
But I guess also Jeff's point that it's time to take stock, so to speak. I mean, to shake up things a little bit. We kind of sleepwalk into traditional ways of relating to each other. NATO is there, and sometimes you need to like shake things up a little bit, given the new world order or dwindling. So.
But I'd rather see that in the form of decided U.S. leadership as opposed to let's just make everything unpredictable.
Like to respond to that, or shall I open?
Sure. I think that when you look at Trump's previous work in the real estate area, he tends to like to have the ability to have a free hand in negotiations, so that he doesn't reveal all of his cards early in a process in order to find out how to make the best deal. And what you see is, I think that we're starting to see some of this translated in his approach, his transactional approach to international relations, where perhaps he doesn't want to reveal all of his intent early because he's looking for the best deal, as it was, both of the United States, America first, as well as the allies and partners to the degree that they support those interests. And so you see that this unpredictability is part of a normal transactional process that he's lived for the last 50 years of his life in the real estate area, and it's difficult to actually get him to abandon that and say that we need to have more predictable behavior on this to be able to reassure allies and partners. I would say that there is a thing that the allies do want to know, that the United States is going to be there, and I think if you look at the rest of the team, that's a signal that, in fact, that we do value that. However, the president himself views a lot of this. I mean, he has really enjoyed the conversations with foreign leaders, and he's come away from those. Every time he meets with somebody, he tends to kind of move closer to the established norms because he has a chance to converse. He has a chance to give his point of view or his views on where the United States should stand, but he also gets a chance to hear from them, and that moves him in certain directions, and we've seen him move and closer to sort of this consensus. But being that as it may, with regard to conversations with China, with conversations with regard to North Korea, with conversations with regard to Russia, he has attempted to say, you cannot predict me, and so you need to hedge in those cases. With regard to allies hedging, that really is not anything that's new. The allies set up hedge strategies during the Reagan administration, in the early part of that administration, where they didn't quite understand where he was going with his confrontational attitude with regard to the Soviet Union. And in the end, that tended to work out not only to the allies' benefit, but also to ours. And with regard to Japan, Japan seems to be on a normal path now, even prior to the election, to becoming more of a normal nation. And at this stage, I'm not sure that that's something that we should actually dissuade them from being, that in fact we would like to see Japan strengthen itself as a nation to perhaps move from a purely defensive stance to having some offensive capabilities. But that will be up to the Japanese people and their government.
You will get the chance to respond. I would just like to bring Julie in, if I may.
Yes, no, I know.
And lots of tricky questions already here. So you will have chances to respond.
We at CNAS like to elevate the debate all by ourselves.
I think that's fantastic.
We
by the
could
way.
go all day.
Yes.
Yeah.
Fantastic, because really, it's really good to have these kind of discussions. But Julie, I want to pitch on to the 25th not summit, or the meeting with NATO. The importance of that, and it comes back to what you already talked about. NATO cannot deliver much on counterterrorism. I mean, it's not really what NATO does. How concerned are you that Trump will, go home from that being disappointed, expecting more, or even more maybe defense budgets? I mean, yeah.
Well, I disagree with that a little bit. I mean, NATO has been in the counterterrorism space. It depends how you define counterterrorism, but if you want to lump all of NATO's work in Afghanistan into counterterrorism, it's got 10 plus years of experience. It's also trained Iraqi forces. It's conducted counter-piracy operations. I mean, it just depends, off the coast of Somalia, at what the spectrum of CT is broadly defined. But I think what we're going to see, and you can see this now with Stoltenberg's statements and his visit to Washington, is we kind of, and I find this happening not just in NATO channels, but with a lot of national leaders. They kind of take what's already in train and present it as, oh, thank you, Mr. President, for bringing this idea up. Here's what we're doing in that regard. Trump likes to have, he has in his head that somehow he's the first person to raise defense spending, despite the fact that we've been talking about it since the 80s. And countless SecDefs and presidents have been railing against the Europeans to spend more on defense. He now has the impression that the money is pouring in, and I think it's okay. You know, it kind of pains me to see the alliance like trying to take what's already happened and make it kind of a Trump victory. But in all honesty, I think the needle's moving on defense spending at long last because of Putin, not because of Trump. But in any case, what they'll do at the NATO summit is no doubt reaffirm the commitments that the alliance already made at the Wales summit and the Warsaw summit to spend more on defense. So in that area, we'll be fine. I think he'll walk away from the May 25th meeting thinking, I really helped move the alliance forward. I'm seeing progress, and I'll keep holding the allies' feet to the fire, particularly the Germans. I mean, he's going to just be on them for a while. So he'll see that as, you know, an area where progress has been made and more work remains to be done. So check the box on that. On CT, I mean, I think the alliance will have to come forward with some fresh ideas. The problem is the alliance often waits for the U.S. lead. And so if the U.S. wants NATO to focus more on CT, again, broadly defined, they'll be waiting for the signal from Mattis and Tillerson at future ministerials to indicate what that looks like. But I think to the extent that the U.S. is going to put forward ideas, they're going to meet resistance among some of the allies saying, look, part of the problem is the alliance for the last, 10, 15 years has focused on COIN and counterterrorism challenges. And we believe that's been detrimental to the alliance's core mission in terms of collective security. And it is time for us to focus on the immediate region around NATO, inside NATO territory, the security challenges there. I mean, we're all here in Europe actually rolling out a report on the GI-UK gap to talk about the North Atlantic. And we have a couple copies in the corner for those that are interested. But
Greenland, Iceland, UK gap.
Yes. We believe that actually the transatlantic partners have neglected the North Atlantic and need to double down. So it's going to be interesting to square this circle to see how the alliance says, yes, Mr. President, we will take your interest in counterterrorism seriously. P.S., what ideas do you have in that regard? But also, we want you to know we want to focus on NATO territory and the security challenges that exist in and around Europe as well.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, we had a number of questions already. So first here, please state your name and affiliation. Anders first. Do you get a microphone there?
Oh, thank you. Good morning. A lot of riveting views. Anders Lomarheim from Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. Strategic ambiguity. I'd love to hear your response to Michèle's response when it comes to strategic ambiguity. It doesn't work very well for friends and allies. When it comes to coining what Trump does on foreign policy, if he has a doctrine, I'd lean towards labeling it dominant bilateralism. It seems to me he has an aversion for any multilateral setting. When he scrapped the TPP, he said we'll rework bilateral trade agreements with each separate nation. He also seems to have been pulled into NATO, as you described well, perhaps knowing that if he doesn't really evaluate the transatlantic relationship, there's no way McMaster and Mattis are going to be effective and might even not want to be a part of his team if he was going to continue on that role. Finally, a question about one person you did not mention. How is Stephen Bannon these days? Thank you.
We have like 6 questions already. I think you can collect a couple.
Sure,
I will collect a few. Is that okay with you?
Yeah.
So the next was lady over here.
Hi, I'm Iselin Hebert-Haukås. I'm with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'd like to hear a little bit more about U.S.-Turkey relations. Juliana mentioned it in her introductory remarks. There's another summit prior to the May 25th, which is May 16, Erdogan going to Washington. So I'd be interested to hear what your expectations is for that, and particularly kind of U.S. policy on Syria after Turkish strikes on Kurdish positions in Syria and Iraq. Thank you.
Take one more, Hilde, and then we'll give a chance to respond.
Thank you so much. My name is Hilde Restad. I'm an associate professor of IR here in Oslo. I'm very sorry not to be able to title you Madam Secretary. That's the side note. No reference to the show. I had a couple of questions for, first, Dr. Hendrix. You're describing, I think, a strategy of a global hegemon that wants to be able to operate in the Arctic, that wants to be able to thwart a rising China and South China Sea. But Trump's doctrine is America first, and he seemed to be promising his voters a less interventionist foreign policy during the election. So, this is just a case of having your cake and eating it too. It seems you want the U.S. to be as dominant as it was after World War II, but with a budget as little as it was after the Cold War. There doesn't seem to be a coherence here. And my other question was to Dr. Flournoy. What is the countervision to America first? It doesn't seem like you refer to the bipartisan consensus. That does not seem to be resonating well with the American voters. So in the next election, what will be the countervision? Thank you.
Thank you. As you know, Hilde is one of the most recognized U.S. commentators in Norwegian media and academia. So that's why I get these very sophisticated questions from her. Very good. Okay, so that's excellent. So who would like to start? Michèle?
Well, I'll take the last question first and then leave the others to Julie and Jerry. I think the countervision needs to be better articulated, and I think we have to sort of meet the American people where they are. I think in the last election cycle, a lot of the economic dislocation and disappointment that some Americans have felt was blamed on sort of trade and globalization. And I think there are certainly elements of global trade that have caused some dislocation in certain sectors. But I think the more fundamental drivers are other things. For example, the dislocation in the coal sector has to do with a fundamentally changing energy landscape, including the American energy revolution, which has made other fuels like natural gas and even renewables increasingly competitive and a cheaper option. Automation, the use of technology to dramatically improve manufacturing productivity, that has probably been the greater cause for displacing manufacturing jobs than, say, trade deals. That said, some of our trade deals need to be improved in terms of creating a level battlefield and so forth. So I think whoever, in the next election, whoever the Democratic candidate is, or needs to start with, a sort of fresh assessment of what do we think is going on in the American economy, and how does that frame our interests and approaches to foreign policy. But I have always believed, and I think even the American people, when surveyed, believe that an engaged the United States that leads abroad, does a better job of not only protecting our interests, but also representing our values and who we are. I was very encouraged after the executive order on immigration was signed. Americans spontaneously showed up at airports with welcome signs, and lawyers showed up to offer free services to anybody who was having a problem getting through immigration. To me, that's the America that I know, and that's who we are. And our foreign policy needs to, reflect not only our narrow interests, but also who we are as a nation and our values. I do think we need to communicate a better sense of priority in terms of particularly when and how we use military force and when we do not. We need to communicate the strategic value of our alliances and our partnerships, that we gain a tremendous amount from this unique and historic network of alliances that we've built around the world. This is not just a burden on the United States. We've built these relationships because we get value from them. And again, when you poll the American people, they don't want to see the U.S. go it alone. They want, when we get into a situation, they want to have partners. They want the international community with us. So, and then lastly, I'd say talking about the, how we best achieve our objectives using all the instruments of power. My favorite Mattis quote recently was when he was CENTCOM commander, he said, if you're going to cut the State Department, you're going to need to get me more ammunition. I mean, the diplomacy and development piece is synergistic with the use of the military. I go to, whether you like the Iran deal or not, the fact is that we used coercive measures like economic sanctions and building an international framework around that, setting the theater with military forces, so the military option was clearly visible to Iran. And those coercive measures used well created the conditions for a productive negotiation that actually created a deal that, however imperfect, bottom line, put time on the clock, the nuclear clock of Iran. Took them from being within months of dashing to a bomb to being well over a year to having to get there. So I guess, I do think the next, the next presidential election needs to do a better job of really unpacking our foreign policy assumptions and first principles and bringing them home to the American people. But I do think a more engaged U.S. leadership role that's based on our interests and values is what's needed.
Thank you.
I'll just say a word about Turkey and then maybe a quick sentence on Bannon. On the Turkey piece, I mean, Erdogan has a lot going for him, that Trump has shown some admiration for authoritarians. And again, it was very complimentary after the referendum, somehow felt the need to congratulate Erdogan in a very troubling situation where Erdogan is obviously consolidating power, and there's some very disturbing trends in terms of what's going on at home. Erdogan will also benefit, no doubt, from the fact that this administration seems less interested in calling countries out for human rights violations, either at home or elsewhere. We saw the Sisi very warm welcome visit in the Oval Office, and so Erdogan doesn't have to worry about being called out in a face-to-face meeting, in the press readout after that meeting or before, whatever they end up doing. But I think he doesn't really have to fear any sharp words from the administration on that front. And then on Syria, I think Erdogan will see it as an opportunity to make his case, to come in and say, look, I'm the partner you need in Syria. Of all the things that Trump said during the campaign on foreign policy, one of the consistent themes that you saw for months on end was this interest in fighting and defeating ISIL. And Erdogan will come in and present himself and his country as one of the strongest partners in Syria. The problem, of course, is the endless friction we've had about the U.S. policy in cooperating with the YPG and the Kurdish groups in northern Syria, and how Erdogan views that. And then there's also the other point of tension, which is the constant requests by Erdogan to extradite Gulen and his perceived role in the attempted coup last year. And so the problem for this administration is Turkey is one of the most complex nuts to crack on U.S. foreign and defense policy, and yet we are going into this meeting with very little staff, very few staff members that could help the administration shape its plan, and so it will essentially go into this meeting, I fear, without a plan and without a strategy, and that's very, very dangerous. They will probably not get the chance. Trump is not reading a lot. He's not getting briefings, and I just worry about him going in with no sense of the Turkey-Russia relationship, which has been warming despite the fact that Turkey shot down a Russian plane. a couple of years ago, we've seen a tremendous warming on the part of those two countries, which I think doesn't serve U.S. interests. And I just don't know how much they're going to be able to ramp up Tillerson's own knowledge of the complex Turkey relationship, or the president's knowledge. And so this is going to be a fascinating meeting to watch, and I hope we don't see an administration really say and do all the wrong things towards Erdogan and signal that we're basically going to turn a blind eye on those human rights violations at home. Bannon, I just say, his star is falling a little bit on the foreign policy front. I mean, HR has supposedly taken the right move in advocating that he be removed from NSC meetings, which I think is the right one. But Bannon is still right there in the inner circle, weighing in daily, hourly on Trump's policies, domestic, foreign, whatever they might be. He's present in a lot of meetings. The open-ended question is the degree to which these competing centers of power will continue to influence Trump's foreign policy. Is Jared Kushner going to continue to play a critical role? Will Steve Bannon continue to play a critical role? And then how does that relate to the more traditional structure of the National Security Council? And that's kind of an open-ended question. I mean, earlier as they were creating the Strategic Initiatives Group and Gorka was coming in and they were supposedly conducting a Russia review, I was very worried. Now it seems that, even Gorka may be headed somewhere else in the administration in the not too distant future. So that I find a little bit reassuring, but the fact that Bannon is there, has strong views and an ideology and a plan, particularly when it comes to the European Union, does worry me a great deal, particularly if he's tutoring the president on, why Brexit's a good thing and why we should push our European friends to follow Britain's lead.
So 3 weeks ago, the word was that Reince Priebus was going to be out as White House Chief of Staff. He's still there. A week ago, Steve Bannon was on his way out. He's still there. The fact of the matter is you're seeing an alignment, as amongst the senior advisors of the president as to what's the proper balance of their role within the administration. And again, it's very reminiscent, actually, if you look back the Reagan administration when there was the triumvirate of Deaver, Baker, and Meese within the White House as to who was going to have the president's ear at any given moment. And the first 6 months was a huge amount of conflict within the White House before it sort of settled out into its balance. And right now, I think if you look at the White House, you're seeing Priebus, Bannon has a role to play in the same way that perhaps Karl Rove had a role to play in the Bush White House. Or Ms. Jarrett had a role to play in the Obama White House, sort of as a senior advisor on policy issues. And also we're seeing a strong role for Vice President Mike Pence, which is really reassuring to me as a native Hoosier myself from Indiana. That's sort of a no-nonsense approach, and Pence had a strong reputation in the House of Representatives as a solid analytical mind, and we also saw that in Indiana as governor there. So we're seeing sort of this emergence of the balance on there. With regard to aggressive bilateralism, I like that. I'm going to write that one down and go back and take a look at it. I don't think that we could have had an election that was more clear about the choice. Just up front, just so you know, was in favor of TPP. I'm sort of a free trader myself on lowering barriers, but it was an election issue. Secretary Clinton was very in favor of it, and had previous strong statements with regard to it, although there was a little bit of hedging during the campaign itself. President Trump was very much against it. There was an election, he won, and here we are. So, now we're here and we have to decide where we go forward. I think that in his business dealings in his previous life, again, all of his negotiations were bilateral, and so that tends to be the way that he tends to view interactions. That's something that we understand that it's a largely very complex international environment, that you work within larger groups of people on that. But this is where we're at, and we'll see where it goes from here. And it's going to be one of those areas we watch very carefully. America First. I tend to view America First as considering America's interests first in negotiations going forward, and then going from that. We have an interest in alliances, but America has an interest that the alliance is there to support our interests as well as we supporting them. I'm not sure exactly what that means within The White House, it seems to have changed since the president's inaugural address and seems to be migrating into a different direction. We'll continue to watch that. So far as interests versus values, this has been an ongoing debate in the United States for 100 years. If you look at sort of the classic comparison between Theodore Roosevelt's administration and Woodrow Wilson's, it was always against interests versus values. Roosevelt was sort of the classic, we want to pursue our interests, which was economic interests in our alliances and in our agreements with overseas partners. Woodrow Wilson was really talking about creating international institution and sort of promoting these values. I see President Trump as going out ideas about individual liberty, our self-determination and free trade and capitalism seem to be the part of that. If those are the interests that he pursues, then I'm happy. There are other aspects of it that seem to break down. Those things somewhat trouble me, but right now we're continuing to watch an evolving process inside his national security apparatus.
All right, thank you. We have at least 4 more questions, so we'll take 2 at a time. The 2 gentlemen in front. You first, sir, then you afterwards.
Thank you. My name is Odd Gunnar Skagestad. I am retired from Norwegian Foreign Service. I have a question concerning the State Department, or rather concerning the predicament that the State Department seems to find itself in. Michèle Flournoy said something or raised some concern about the slowness of the Trump administration in appointing persons to the senior echelons of the various government ministries. I, in particular, understand the State Department. And apparently that might have some negative effects on America's diplomacy and clout in the world. As a Norwegian, I'm not too worried about that prospect. We are accustomed to any American president taking his or her time in appointing ambassadors to Norway. But that is a narrow perspective, I understand that. What I would like to know is how you see the situation of the developments concerning the budgetary allocations to the State Department. The State Department has been the loser through the past 50 or 60 years in the, let's say, interagency fights for budgetary means in the United States. And the influence has been gradually tipping in the favor of the National Security Council versus the State Department. Now I understand, so this is nothing new in the Trump administration, but I understand that there are some proposals to cut the allocations to the State Department rather drastically. And Jim Mattis has been quoted as saying that if the State Department, if their budget is cut much more, he will have to ask for more ammunition and guns, just to illustrate his opinion about what should be the proper balance. So could you say something about how you see the prospects of the developments concerning the State Department? Thank you.
You pass the microphone to your colleague, your other retired ambassador. So we have 2 retired
Yes,
ambassadors.
I'm very happy you are saving me for the problem. I say once again, retired ambassador for thank you very much for that. Very kind of you. Well, it strikes me that it was Prime Minister Macmillan who once said, he didn't say, he was asked by a journalist, and the question was really, Mr. Prime Minister, what are really in politics the most driving elements? And the Prime Minister said, events, young man, events. So regardless of what we can talk about the future, events are very, very important. The second element, just a short comment on predictability. Of course, we are all fond of predictability, but I think we all have to agree to the fact in foreign policy, security policy, sometimes unpredictability, uncertainty is a valid point. If you look at the nuclear policy, the Brits used to say, in the uncertainty lies the deterrence. I don't like to push it too far, of course, but there are elements when uncertainty, particularly for great power, may be a good thing. Now, 2 points on the transatlantic things and also challenges in the China Sea. If you look at the Russian point, where the Russians, of course, always have maintained a policy of not exactly challenging, trying to teach the Americans a little bit about their position in Europe. Of course, the Russians have always wanted, according to what they say, we want to do away with NATO. We want to establish, of course, our pan-European security map, new security organizations. Are you a little bit afraid, or do you think that the Russians will again push this element in their relations with the United States, or is this something which they will accept? NATO is there to stay. So will they make a problem about it, or will they more or less carry on this policy? Second element concerns the China Sea. How do you view, will the Chinese continue to play a fairly, let's say, conservative policy in the South China Sea? Of course, they're challenging the American Navy to a certain extent, but in most cases, they have tried to not be too aggressive. So how do you view, let's say, Chinese American rivalries in the South China Sea, taking into consideration the so-called tilt to China? I don't see too much, for the time being, of the tilt to China, so maybe the Americans have forgotten about it. But how do you view that Chinese-American rivalries in the South China Sea? Will they continue, or where are we now on that? Thank you.
Thank you. That was many questions in two. So maybe you will start this time.
Sure.
It was
I'll
also for you, I think.
So I'll start there with the predictability point and its relative role in this. One of the things that's happened, and we've done some other writing on this at the Center for New American Security that deals with sort of the United States in the beginning of the 1980s, after the Goldwater-Nichols Act, where we started to look at the joint force, began to look at a series of joint documents as to how the joint force would fight. And one of the ideas that emerged out of that was phasing, or phase 0, actually beginning phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, 4. Now we're phase 0 through phase 5, with phase 3 essentially being critical combatant operations. And this is how we plan on how we stage and how we roll into warfare environments, and then build up over time, and then have a plan for what happened after combatant operations is over. But phase 0, phase 1, phase 2 are what occur prior to phase 3. And what we've done is we've sort of defined the playbook on how we conduct those. But phase 3 is this barrier that once you broach through that, then we're into combatant operations, and we have sort of a different playbook that falls on after that. Unfortunately, in many senses, we've become predictable on how we approach things, that we'll go through these things. And as we look at both Russia and China, that they seem to be living underneath that phase 3 barrier, that they understand that there's areas where you can operate against the Americans. We would call this asymmetric warfare. It's little green men, it's the gray zone, or whatever you want to term it. But they understand that they will press in those environments, and they will understand the United States isn't going to react in a kinetic way with warfare, and they've taken advantage of that predictability. We've also had a period of time after Iraq and Afghanistan where we sort of had a reset of U.S. foreign policy, where we wanted to become a little more normal, a little less aggressive in some of our external relations, less interventionist, as it were, and that they've taken advantage of that. I'm, still, very opposed to Russia occupation of Crimea or its actions in Ukraine, just as I'm opposed to China's building of these artificial islands in the South China Sea and then attempting to make claims of sovereignty. To me, they're both similar movements that have been going on over the last decade that we're going to have to figure out how to counter. And that's where we find ourselves today. I think South China Sea is still rife and very tense, and could be an area where you could see an outbreak of some type of an operation there. We're going to have to be very careful on how we react to that, because we do want to reset it to a status ante quo into that area, and yet we have these 4 islands that are ready to receive Chinese troops. So the barracks are there, the revetted bunkers and hardened aircraft hangars are there. They can roll in missiles. In 24 hours, they could fully militarize those and begin laying down an A2AD, or an anti-access air denial barrier, in the South China Sea that would make it very difficult for the United States to be able to operate in that and be able to conduct freedom of navigation operations or even free trade in that area. And we have treaty obligations with the Philippines that we would have to look at, and how we're going to uphold those. So we're entering a period now of a snapback where you might have to escalate to de-escalate. The United States might want to start using some of that language that we've seen with others. And again, this gets into areas of unpredictability, where we're going to have to reintroduce the idea that perhaps you don't want us to do this, so maybe you need to reconsider your own options, be that China or Russia.
Question on State Department. I don't know if you feel.
So let me respond to the two of the other questions. So the first is on the budget cuts and the proposed reorganization of the State Department. And I think there are two, separate but related issues. One is the headquarters in Washington, and the other is the global footprint of our diplomatic service and our development assistance efforts. I am far more worried about the latter than I am the former. So Rex Tillerson comes into this job having gone through some substantial cost cutting at Exxon, where he delayered his headquarters. He talks about having achieved not only greater efficiency, but greater agility among the headquarters staff. And I think he will likely bring that sort of executive experience to the State Department headquarters. And some of the reasons for not filling these jobs, I think, is that he's not sure he's going to need all these jobs filled. And so I do think that we can expect him to go through a kind of fundamental redesign of the headquarters, which, we have to, we'll wait and see how that comes out. But that's truthfully not where the money is. The real money is in State Department programs and global footprint. And here, some of the early indicators are worrisome. There's talk of, identifying the top X number of countries that are most vital to our interests and literally pulling back from everywhere else. And so closing whole embassies and only having a consulate in a country. Closing dozens of AID missions across the world. I think, these are very cost-effective ways of maintaining U.S. influence in the world and of helping other countries be more effective in lifting their own populations out of poverty. I'll give you an example. I'm on the board of CARE, and I just was part of a learning tour that went to Nepal and India, particularly the state of Bihar, which is one of the poorest states in India, 100 million people. You'll hear talking heads from the far right in the United States saying we get absolutely no value from our foreign assistance. This is throwing money away when it should be spent on the American people. CARE was the pioneer of one intervention, which had to do with applying antibiotic ointment to the umbilical cord of a newborn, that when demonstrated was then brought to the government of India and scaled across much of the country, and has resulted in the places where it's been applied, that one little intervention, which is very inexpensive, 30% reduction in infant mortality. So tell me that a development assistance doesn't work. There are cases where it doesn't, but there are plenty of cases where we can demonstrate a best practice, work with a government or a set of governments to scale it, and fundamentally, save lives and also bring countries up the economic development ladder so that ultimately they become important trading partners. That is the post-World War II story of so many countries that were devastated through U.S. assistance were developed into very important trading partners and allies. So anyway, I am very concerned about this because I think we could become penny wise and pound foolish, as we say in the U.S., if we're not careful about how this reorganization works. On your point about Russia, I would just like to say, I think whether it's their intervention in the U.S. election, whether it's their intervention in a number of European elections, even as we're watching this happen now, whether, the whole range of actions that Russia has taken, to me, communicates that Putin is still very interested in the objective of trying to weaken Europe and weaken the transatlantic community, to create greater openings for Russia to re-establish some kind of sphere of influence. I think the proposal of these pan-European security institutions that conveniently exclude the United States is one of the tactics that we're likely to see him continue to try to use. I don't think he'll be successful because I think NATO is stronger and more resilient than that. But I think he'll keep trying.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on that, I mean, I think it's been rejected repeatedly by Europeans and by past U.S. administrations, and so he may give it another go with this administration, but I think slowly we're seeing that the strategy is ultimately more work to undermine the existing institutions than putting forward proposals about new ones. And he's been successful in terms of disinformation campaigns, attempts to redraw the borders of Europe, the very aggressive cyber activity across the European continent and in that gray zone between NATO territory and Russia, and doing everything he can to interfere in the political processes of our European allies and, of course, in our own election last fall. So his strategy is multifold. I mean, well, the overarching strategy is, you know, undermining those institutions, but he's using an array of very effective tactics to do so.
Okay, we have 2 more questions, so if you still have energy, we'll collect them. Sir, in front row here, you first.
Thank you very much. My name is Per Sulgi Kasai. I'm the Central Board member of the Norwegian Labour Party International Forum in Oslo. I start by threat assessment, so why we are worried about in the world. This is, in my opinion, the Islamic fundamentalism, which is a great threat, and also expansionism, call it under Putinism and so on and so forth. So the good news in the Middle East is that now Trump administration is aligning itself with the alliance of the Arab nations, and they call it sometimes the Arab NATOs, against the expansionism of the Iranian regime in 4 countries: Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon. This is the good news. But the bad news is that we've forgotten China was not only a trade competitor and threat, which Mr. Trump called always. China is much more, given the fact that they are helping in the Security Council to veto, and Mr. Putin wants really China to be a strategic alliance with them, and this is very difficult and very dangerous. And also given the fact that China is not only a trade threat, but recently they have been sending the vessels, the military vessels, to Djibouti, and where they were really in the same area as you have your bases in, I think is Lemonium base or something you have in American with 4,000 bases, soldiers. So the relation between the US and China is very pivotal in order to contain the expansionism, and also in order to try to also contain this aggression in the Security Council, and then that will be that makes the Security Council as much more than this lame duck they call it for the years to come. So the only help and the hope we have it is NATO, and I agree with Ambassador. Is it a threat? I don't call him, but the retired ambassador. He was very active and very dynamic with this question. So that China is trying to Russia is trying to dismantle the EU and also NATO, and they are suffering from the Warsaw syndrome, Warsaw Pact syndrome. Thank you.
It's a comment more than a question, perhaps, but you can comment on a comment. Last but not least, Rolf Tamnes will have the final question. Oh, sorry, if we don't have time for more. So.
Rolf Tamnes, Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. Thank you, first of all, for enlightening us about these key issues. I would like to bring the attention back to the question of defense priorities. And you mentioned the potential increase in defense spending, the expansion of the force structure and things like that. But there is another dimension to it, and that is your effort to maintain the technological lead. And that was, it has had a certain priority in recent years with the third offset and things like that. I haven't heard that much about this question lately, so I'm very curious when it comes to, is there any interest in this present administration to the extent there is an administration, since you have hardly a deputy around? But your reading of your priority of technology in the years to come, that is the broader question. Then, of course, since you, Dr. Hendrix, is so much interested in the Navy, and you are now in a naval environment, to put it that way, when you come to Norway. And a key starting point here is that you will probably focus much more on high intensity, Article 5 in a European context, and perhaps an expansion of the structure up to 350 plus, as you indicated. That brings us to the question, where does this lead us in a European and a NATO context? And more specifically, will there be any role for a carrier in a European scenario in the future? Thank you.
Carrier back to Norway. Yeah. This is the last round of responses, so I suggest we do the opposite order that we did initially. So you start, and then we go around. This is the last round of comments.
Okay, so I'm going to take it real quick. So yes, there's still an interest in the third offset. One of the people that was kept on and is still in the, we have a Deputy Secretary of Defense, is Robert O'Rourke, essentially Mr. Third Offset himself, and our former CEO at the Center for New American Security, and my former boss when he was the Undersecretary of the Navy. So as long as Bob's on the job, Third Offset's there, and I think that Bob is still on the job because Secretary Mattis is interested in that. There's a number of key technologies that are key enablers going forward that we need to maintain our investments in. Directed energy, hypersonics, robotics and automation. All these things are going to be there, will be part of our conversation. And when we come to the 350-ship Navy, one of the key questions that I have is a room in the definition that one of those ships or 10 of those ships or maybe 20 would be actually unmanned or automated, because they do bring a lot to the environment. So far as your point that I'm in Norway, so I'm in a maritime environment, we're all in a maritime environment. The fact is we all too often forget that. This is a globalized maritime economy. That's one of those things that we have to keep in mind, that the entire world economy moves on the backs of large container ships. And to the degree that we suddenly refocus on that every now and then, every generation, is to our benefit, and it's to our disadvantage when we forget that, which is how you get to 275 ships, is you kind of forget that. Coming back to the other point that was made over here, that when we talk about Putin expansionism and China, well, we're actually seeing those both are representations of a desire to establish a sphere of influence. And this comes back to your question earlier as well, that the one thing that we need to keep in mind is that they can establish a sphere of influence, be it in Eastern Europe, by linking up Kaliningrad with Crimea and then down to Syria by putting up these A2AD bubbles, that in fact that delegitimizes the global international system that we've been able to develop at this point in time, and it really places into question U.S. leadership and our global alliances in NATO, because once someone is able to establish a sphere of influence, it causes others to tip that they want their own sphere, and then you get instability in the global international environment. The one thing that we haven't mentioned here that I am concerned about, because it touches on the EU, is China is now beginning to look at expansion into space. And so China recently has 3 planned missions to the moon. They do not look at the moon the same way that the United States has in the past, as sort of this nice international territory where there'll be no claims. China's looking to have 3 landings on the moon. They're looking to establish a permanent colony on the moon. And in fact, they're working right now with the EU to partner on that colony. That has strategic implications for the United States and for all of us, that the idea that China might establish some sort of a permanent colony, which undoubtedly would have some sort of a military characteristic, because the moon will be a center of gravity, for all mining and commercial interests as we develop over the next century. So those are my replies.
I'll leave it to you.
Okay. Let me just come back to your question about defense priorities, because it's a very good one. There is a lot of talk of increased defense spending, and I think there will be some. But the $54 billion figure that's been put out there, I think the Pentagon, in its projections based on the work that was done in the Obama administration, was already planning to spend about $30 billion of that. Absent a budget deal, it's questionable whether it will be $54 billion, whether it will be less. Some are asking for more. But I think what worries me is that if you left, the question is how to spend whatever money that is there most wisely. And left to their own devices, the services would first correct any shortfalls in readiness, current readiness. Second, grow force structure, get bigger. And third, turn to modernization. Now, if you get less than what's expected, that's not going to work very well because, and I think this is where the role of the Secretary and the role of the Office of the Secretary becomes very, very important in forcing tough trade-offs. Because I think if you're looking at whether it's the need to deter a more aggressive Russia or the need to be able to compete and shape the calculus of a more powerful China, I don't think we can contain China. I don't think we should try to contain China. We will have very important cooperative elements of the relationship, but also important elements of competition. But we have to be ready for that. And the investments that we make in modernization in specific areas, whether it's missile defense, whether it's electronic warfare, cyber, space, there are whole, countering this A2AD environment, there are a whole suite of technologies which we have to maintain or increase our investment in if we're going to be able to deter and prevail in the future. And if we simply go after this increase, if we simply think about this increase in defense spending as, oh, now it's time to, be more ready and bigger, we will miss the boat on the critical investments and capabilities in the future. The good news, I do think that even beyond Bob Work, because his successor has now been named and is going through the confirmation process, I do think Secretary Mattis has embraced the third offset. Everybody hates the name. It's going to be called something else in this administration, but don't be worried. It's still the third offset, but it'll have a new name that's more accessible to people who don't know about the first two offsets. But I do think this is a key issue because left to its own devices, I think the Pentagon will not spend the money wisely, and it will take some real leadership and discipline imposed from the top to make sure those trade-offs are made in favor of the future capabilities that will be decisive.
All right. We touched upon so many topics. It's difficult for me to summarize. I don't think I'll even try, but it's been really enlightening. It shows, of course, that there is a complex. It's not an easy answer to the Trump status, so to speak, at this stage. But we see some patterns. We have some disagreements about how to interpret those, but that's good because that keeps our mind sharp. That's what we should do as analysts. So with no further ado, let's just give the panel a great hand, big hand, and thank you so much for sharing the talk today. And before you leave, guys, one reminder: on Friday we have American Ambassador Christopher Hill visiting us. You know him; he's one of the most experienced ambassadors the U.S. had, and he worked many years later now on the Korean Peninsula. So this is a scoop. He's not very often in Norway. So please, I don't remember exactly when it is. Looking at somebody back there. 11 o'clock on Friday. So show up for that. Thank you.